impossible not to have heard of Derrick Todd Lee.
She was a very hard worker, a person who really cared about the students around her.
This is a violent human being that needs to die for what he's done.
Although he was linked by DNA to 7, convicted of 2, we have him at 17 in the book.
Skating on thin ice, Louisiana was left in shock as it was linked to multiple deaths and only convicted of 2. On the other hand, the capital city of Louisiana, Baton Rouge, the second largest city in the state, was known for something much more sinister between 1992 and 2006. What happened in Louisiana? Who were the multiple deaths linked to? And why? Let's dive deep into the shocking and horrible happenings of a once peaceful city. Derrick's parents, Samuel Ruth and Florence Lee, gave birth to him on November 5, 1968, in St. Francisville, Louisiana. Derrick was the only son of Florence's 4 children, born when she was barely 17 years old. The first terrible aspect of Derrick's upbringing was the absence of his biological father for a significant portion of his life following birth. Due to his serious mental health problems, Samuel ultimately left the family to make amends with his first wife. He obviously had issues because there were rumors that he attempted to kill a young woman and was later admitted to a mental health facility. Meanwhile, Florence remarried Coleman Barrow, who provided Derrick and his sisters with immediate paternity but was extremely strict. He and Florence were quite devout and set extraordinarily high standards for the kids, particularly in terms of their schooling. But regrettably, Derrick had significant difficulty in this area. He had no interest in learning and was quickly being surpassed in school by even his younger sister. He had trouble maintaining even low grades though, and his standard intelligence quotient was not very high. Derrick's mother was fully aware of his stepfather's physical abuse of him, but she took no action to stop it. In addition to having a terrible home life, he experienced severe bullying at school because he was enrolled in special education classes. Because of the immense weight of all this stress, Derrick began acting strangely at a young age. He was well known in his neighborhood as a peeping Tom by the time he was 11 years old, and he continued this pastime into his adult years. He also enjoyed sleeping with animals, which is a terrible habit that can be a major indicator of bad times to come. When Derrick was 13 years old, he was arrested for breaking into and damaging a nearby candy store. This marked the beginning of his formal rap. Nevertheless, he was put on probation after entering a guilty plea to these counts, but things got worse from there. He was detained and accused of attempting second-degree murder when he was 16 years old for slapping a boy with a knife during a brawl. Although he had dropped out of high school and had been in trouble ever since he managed to avoid being placed in a juvenile detention center, it appears that he was released fairly quickly, but at the age of 17, he was arrested again, this time for his dirty little peeping habit. Derrick was detained again in 1988 on suspicion of robbery, but the charges were later dropped, allowing Derrick to be freed once more. Derrick eventually got married to a woman called Jacqueline Sims after this release. Sadly for Jackie, Derrick was an awful husband. The couple wed on August 17, 1988, and went on to produce 2 children together, a daughter called Doris and a boy named Derrick. In addition to being adulterous and aggressive, he also got into several arguments with Jackie's father and once even threatened him with a gun. On top of all of this, he would regularly just abandon her and leave her to find a way to care for their children on her own. Despite these problems, Jackie was a devoted mother and wife who never held grudges against Derrick. But whether it was the strain of his failing marriage or something else entirely, she often denounced her husband to the police for his violence and negligence. Derrick began to commit the scariest random acts of violence around 1993. Derrick had clearly been insane for a good portion of his life, but until now, his acts of violence had always appeared to be intended towards someone he knew personally or felt had wronged him. Michelle Chapman and her partner were hanging out in Bueller Plains Cemetery in Zachary, Louisiana, in April 1993. They were parked in their car, doing what adolescents do, and were too busy to notice that Derrick was nearby, doing his thing, However, because of the rain and their distraction, they were oblivious to Derrick's approach to the car while brandishing a machete. Without hesitation, he opened the car door and began to swing. He struck the boyfriend of Michelle in the hands, arms, and scalp. He also struck Michelle in the leg, nearly cutting her right foot. He was very well dressed, with a red plaid shirt tucked inside his trousers and a clean-shaven face. "The only thing that sticks in my memory are his large, bloodshot, angry eyes," Michelle subsequently remarked. Now, what should we call that? Was it as a result of jealousy? Why would Derrick want to hurt innocent youngsters who were just making out? Fortunately for Michelle and her boyfriend, Derrick's attack was cut short when the headlights of another vehicle shone on their Toyota Camry. Derrick grabbed the keys, let go of his machete, and bolted. Unable to escape, Michelle and her partner secured the car and sat there. When a policeman went to take a closer look and saw that the interior light was on, he found that Michelle and her partner were covered in blood and only partially dressed. They were taken right away to hospitals in the area, and the cemetery was searched. But any such evidence had long since been swept away by that evening's intense rainfall. Michelle didn't recognize her attacker until 1999, 6 years later, when she identified him from a picture lineup. However, nothing had been done by then, and the second-degree attempted murder statute of limitations had expired. Derrick received a 4-year sentence of hard labor in the state jail after being found guilty of burglary in 1993. When he was granted parole in 1995, he was promptly caught again for his favorite pastime, peeping through windows. Still, he was sentenced to 2 years of unsupervised probation for this. In 1996, Jackie and Derrick found themselves surprisingly wealthy. After her father was killed in an explosion at work, Jackie received compensation from his employer of $250,000. Derrick bought extravagant presents for his love Cassandra with his newly acquired cash. He quickly spent all of the settlement money and was once more on the verge of financial ruin. But with Derrick expecting a new child, things were getting harder financially. Cassandra was pregnant with their son, Derrick, whom she gave birth to in July 1999. Did you know that Derrick was arrested for lots of things? That's right. But let's just move on to the tougher crimes he committed. He finally lost it in 1998 and started murdering women in Baton Rouge and the surrounding areas with great savagery. On April 18, 1998, Derrick was definitively connected to his first murder. In Zachary, Louisiana, there lived Randy Mae Brewer, a 28-year-old home health nurse. She had a 3-year-old boy and was divorced. On April 19, 1998, the morning following her apprehension, their neighbor Kathy discovered her son Michael walking aimlessly in their garden. Michael was thrilled to see Kathy and asked if her kid could play with him outside. Kathy said that was okay, but that she would prefer to speak with Michael's mother, Randy, first. At that point, Michael informed Kathy that his mother was missing and that he was unable to locate her. Fearful, Kathy picked up Michael and escorted him into the house. She discovered blood on the kitchen floor immediately away, and as she proceeded through the home, she discovered more and more blood in each room. After grabbing Michael, she fled to her house to get her husband, and the both of them made a call to the police. In June 1999, Derrick was arrested after breaking into a woman's flat and stalking her. Fortunately, Colette Walker was able to diffuse the tension and turn it down. Nonetheless, Derrick quietly departed her apartment after giving her his phone number. It would have been a relief if he hadn't been discovered lingering in her parking lot and peeping through her windows the following weeks. Sadly, Derrick admitted and confessed to the charges and was put on supervised probation, which is bad news for Colette and society. He went straight after his release to find Colette, but luckily, she had moved out by the time he arrived at her flat. She was undoubtedly really fortunate, since who can say what he would have done if he had discovered her? She most certainly wouldn't have survived a second time. Cassandra submitted a request for a protective order against Derrick in February 2000. Their relationship had descended into physical violence and tremendous turbulence. Less than a week after she submitted this request, Derrick found her and severely beat her in the parking lot of a nearby club, indicating that she was clearly afraid for her life. He was ultimately taken into custody for this and imprisoned for a year. After being freed in February 2001, he was jailed again for breaking his chances of release in May. But for this, he got nothing more than a severe talking down. He was not returned to prison or had his parole revoked. How did he manage to commit all of these horrible crimes and consistently receive nothing as a punishment? These oversights would ultimately prove tragic for so many families. Gina Wilson Green, a 41-year-old nurse, failed to report for duty on September 24, 2001. Since this was really out of character for her, one of her co-workers offered to go to her house to check on her. Sadly, she wasn't at home. After raping her, Derrick killed her by strangulation. In the weeks before her passing, Gina is said to have confided in friends and family that she felt watched or followed. Although not much, the police were able to collect a sample of the offender's DNA from the scene. Since this sample did not produce any matches in the DNA database, the DNA test was essentially a bust. Geraldine DeSoto, a 21-year-old student at Louisiana State University, was discovered dead in her house by her spouse on January 14, 2002. Derrick had brutally assaulted and stabbed her to death. Police were able to collect her attacker's DNA from under her fingernails because of the violent struggle that had occurred prior to her death, but initially they were unable to match it to anyone. On May 31, 2002, 4.5 months later, Derrick killed 22-year-old Charlotte Murray Pace in her flat. Charlotte was an exceptionally intelligent young lady, having completed her high school education at the age of 15, going on to college at the age of 20, and earning her master's degree in business administration by the time she was 22. She probably had a fantastic future in front of her, and it was unfortunate that she was never able to enjoy it. Charlotte bravely refused to go quietly and put up a fierce struggle. Meanwhile, she was covered in defensive wounds, and her flat was completely destroyed. She put up the fight of her life, but in the end, she was overpowered, raped, and stabbed more than 80 times. Later that same day, her flatmate discovered her body. Given that the females had only been residing in the flat for a week or so, the police were taken aback by the audacious attack. Derrick had obviously killed someone in broad daylight in a very populated neighborhood close to the university. Everywhere Charlotte lived, students were swarming the neighborhood on their way to and from classes. Police were therefore optimistic that someone would have seen anything if they searched the area and spoke to some of the pupils. Sadly, though, they were unsuccessful. A DNA sample taken from the rape was really the only proof they had. The criminal lab received the DNA sample right away for analysis, but no matches were found. Meanwhile, the police, feeling more than a little perplexed, began to reach for straws. They looked into other unsolved murders in the area, thinking that perhaps they could uncover one that was connected in some way. When they discovered Gina Wilson Green's unsolved murder, the police felt like they were onto something, even though it seemed like a long shot. Gina was murdered 8 months earlier at her Stanford Avenue house. Why is this important, you may be wondering? Well, Charlotte and her roommate once lived at Stanford Avenue before they moved to their new apartment where Charlotte was murdered. By analyzing the DNA samples that had been taken from both scenes, authorities were able to validate their hypothesis that there was a strong probability of a connection between both crimes. As it turned out, they were a wonderful fit. The same individual had brutally murdered Gina Wilson Green and Charlotte Murray Pace, as police now knew beyond a reasonable doubt. A multi-agency task team was established with the express purpose of finding this man after receiving this new information. The task group started by compiling a profile of criminals. They said they were searching for a white man in his 20s who was in good physical shape. They made a composite sketch of the person they believed they could be searching for, made it public, and inadvertently received several tips in this manner. They all genuinely believed they were onto something, even though none of them ever accomplished anything. They launched a DNA dragnet of more than 1,000 white guys since they were so sure of their profile. Derrick hit once more when they were distracted and completely off course. Diane Alexander heard a knock at her door while getting ready for work on July 9, 2002. Upon answering, she was welcomed by a friendly man who merely requested to use her phone. She had no idea that she was in direct confrontation with a serial killer. She provided him with her phone and a phone book, but when he was standing outside making his call, she actually shut and locked the door. Surprisingly, he decided to bring the phone cord with him, which would prove to be a costly error. Before Derrick got into a car and drove off, Diane's son pursued him as far as he could and made sure he got a close-up look at him. Diane was fortunate to escape unharmed, but it took her nearly a week to feel well enough to provide authorities with a thorough description of her attacker. At first, Diane's attack was handled as a whole different situation. The task team was still searching in the incorrect place for a suspect, since they were not actively working with the local police enforcement. On July 12, 2002, 3 days later, Derrick abducted Pamela Kinnemore, who was 44 years old then, from her house. Pamela was a devoted mother, wife, and businesswoman. When her husband, Byron, eventually reported her missing, authorities searched the Kinnemore family's property but found nothing. They were only able to conclude that there had not been any break-ins. It seems that Pam had forgotten her keys in the back door when she came home from work that evening. When her husband got home that evening, he discovered them. It took 4 days for Pam's body to finally be discovered. She was located just outside of Baton Rouge in Whiskey Bay. She had been raped and stamped to death before her body had been hidden in some bushes. A couple of 100 feet from Pam's body, police found a telephone cord that was later determined to be the identical same telephone cord used in the attempted strangulation of Diane Alexander. Meanwhile, DNA testing proved that this was exactly the same work of the man who had killed Gina Wilson Green, Charlotte Murray Pace, Geraldine DeSoto, and Randy Mae Brewer, but no one had connected her disappearance to these crimes yet. Everyone was terrified at the moment, and despite the media and law enforcement's increased attention to these crimes, the man didn't seem to be planning to back down. On November 21, 2002, while visiting her mother's gravestone at a cemetery just outside of Baton Rouge, Trinisha Dene Colombe was kidnapped by Derrick. Trinisha, a 23-year-old Army veteran, was stunning and incredibly clever. She had aspirations of joining the United States Marine Corps. 3 days later, when her abandoned automobile had been reported to the police, her body was discovered barely 20 miles from the cemetery. She had been killed by beatings and rape. DNA found on her body connected her death to the Baton Rouge serial killer, and the task team was at this point incredulous. They had almost little evidence and, as far as they knew, no reliable witnesses, but they still couldn't seem to get the better of this man. They appeared to be searching for a ghost. Carrie Lynn Yoder, a 26-year-old woman, was the last victim Derrick took from her flat at Louisiana State University in March 2003. Her partner filed a missing persons report after 2 days without hearing from her. When the police first searched her flat, they essentially turned up with nothing to start their inquiry. Furthermore, since Carrie's computer, keys, and wallet have remained in the house, they were able to rule out robbery as a motive. Regretfully, upon questioning by the police, it was discovered that none of her neighbors had heard or seen anything unusual. In Whiskey Bay 10 days later, a fisherman found Carrie's body. She was nonetheless abandoned close to the location where Pam Kinnemore's body had been discovered. However, Carrie's body appeared to have been carelessly thrown from a bridge, in contrast to Pam's, whose body had been carefully hidden. Carrie had also been killed by a Baton Rouge serial murderer, as evidenced by DNA testing after she had been beaten, raped, and strangled to death. The investigation was excruciating, since, at this point, the detectives felt no closer to discovering the truth than they had when they started looking for this psychopath nearly a year ago. They were desperate. They had put in so much time trying to solve this case that the detectives had been paid overtime totaling more than $500,000. Everything finally kind of came to a head in April 2003 after a woman complained to the Zachary Police Department. Given the situation, she didn't want to take any chances, and neither did Zachary Police Department, as she felt like she was being followed. Nevertheless, they investigated the accusation and found boot prints outside her bedroom window, leading them to believe that Derrick Todd Lee, their favorite neighborhood Peep Tom, was probably to a fault. Unbeknownst to the task team, on May 5, 2003, the Zachary Police Department carried out a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Derrick. Upon analysis, his sample revealed that it exactly matched every homicide the Baton Rouge serial killer had committed. Authorities tried to arrest him after all this time, but it turned out that he and his family had already left. Suddenly, they had their man. They went after him immediately and in full force. He was nowhere to be found, not at his house, not at his mother's, not at Cassandra's. Not to add that on the day his DNA sample was collected, Derrick's wife had taken their kids out of school. Although there weren't many locations where Derrick Todd Lee could have hidden out, He certainly gave it a try in Atlanta after it was quickly revealed that he was the main suspect in all of these highly publicized murders. But eventually, someone tracked him down thanks to a phone call he made to a friend, and on May 27, 2003, he was arrested just outside of a tire store. After a smooth extradition back to Louisiana, he was charged with the murders in June 2003. The defense said that he suffered from significant mental impairments, making him incompetent to stand trial. Derrick was found to have an incredibly low IQ of only about 65. As a point of reference, the average person's IQ is normally between 90 and 110. Nevertheless, this defense was rejected, and the judge found Derrick to be competent to face trial. Meanwhile, in an attempt to obtain the death sentence or life in prison, prosecutors opted to move on with the charges related to the murders of Charlotte Murray Pace and Geraldine DeSoto because they believed they had the best chance of succeeding in securing a conviction. Following less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury on August 10, 2004, convicted Derrick guilty of second-degree murder and Geraldine DeSoto's death. A mandatory life sentence was also attached to the verdict. After 2 months, in October 2004, Derrick was found guilty for the second time, this time for the first-degree murder of Charlotte Murray Pace. The testimony of Diane Alexander greatly bolstered the case against him. The court sentenced Derrick to death by lethal injection on the jury's recommendation. He was to be confined to Louisiana State Maximum Security Prison's death row for the remainder of his days on Earth. Lee, though, died before his sentence could be executed. At the age of 47, he died on January 21, 2016, due to heart illness. Since Derrick never confessed, there will likely always be a great deal of conjecture about his possible involvement in other unsolved deaths in the area, and we may never fully understand the scope of his deadly rampage. What do you think about Derrick? Do you think that if his upbringing had been different, the outcome of his life would have taken a different turn? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And please don't forget to check out any of our videos displayed on your screen for more videos like this.